A sloth, a donkey, and a curious human. Send a prompt and see what they're doing. One hits record with a question on his mind. Two brothers pick it up, see what they find. Corn takes his time, Herman's got the facts. Back and forth, they never hold back. My weird prompts, come on in, that's where we begin. My weird prompts, glad you're here.
This episode was generated using artificial intelligence. Please verify facts.
You know, Corn, this whole show runs on GPU compute, and we wouldn't be here without Modal.
Seriously. And that's what powers all our text-to-speech. Everything you're hearing right now.
They're an AI infrastructure platform. Developers use them to run GPU workloads in the cloud with zero infrastructure headaches.
If you're building anything with AI, check them out. Modal.com. So Daniel sent us a heavy one today, and it really cuts through the usual tactical noise to get to the cold, hard math of survival. He's looking at the strategic nightmare of Iran's cluster munition ballistic missiles, and the impossible resource choices that come with them. He quotes Brigadier General David Schenck, who basically highlights that we're facing a mathematical nightmare. Daniel asks, what is a soldier's life worth? What is the value of a high-demand, low-density asset like an E3 AWACS or a Patriot radar? He's pointing out that while we're looking at interception rates, the real story is the capacity gap. In simulations for the 2030s, which we're basically living in now, the modeling suggested we needed 48 Patriot battalions to handle the threat. At the time, we had 14. Today, in April 2026, we've only scraped our way up to 16. This isn't just a gap, it's a chasm.
It really is, Corn. And just to set the stage for everyone listening, today's episode of My Weird Prompts is actually being powered by Google Gemini 3 Flash. It's helping us parse through some of this dense military theory. But man, the numbers Daniel is citing from General Schenck are sobering. We are talking about a fundamental shift in how war is waged in the air. For decades, we've thought about missile defense as a 1-to-1 or 2-to-1 game. You fire a Scud, we fire a Patriot. But when you introduce cluster munitions, submunitions that disperse in flight, the math breaks. It's not a duel anymore, it's trying to stop a shotgun blast with a pair of tweezers.
It's the ultimate quantity as a quality of its own argument, right? Except the quantity is being delivered by a very sophisticated delivery vehicle. Herman Poppleberry, you've been digging into the recent strikes in the Middle East. We saw the destruction of a U.S. Air Force E-3 Sentry, the AWACS, at Prince Sultan Air Base back in March. That's a $700 million aircraft. If that's the target, and it's being hunted by cluster munitions, how does a commander even begin to allocate resources?
That's the high-demand, low-density, or HDLD problem Daniel mentioned. We only have about 16 or 17 operational E-3s left in the entire fleet. They are the quarterbacks of the sky. If you lose one, you don't just lose a plane, you lose the eyes and ears of an entire theater. The Iranian strategy with cluster munitions is brilliant, in a dark way because it exploits our biggest weakness. We have very expensive bullets and not nearly enough of them. A Patriot interceptor costs between $3 and $4 million. If Iran fires a ballistic missile that costs a fraction of that but it carries dozens of submunitions, the defender is in a lose-lose scenario.
Right, because you have to decide when to shoot. And this is where the discrimination problem comes in, which Daniel highlighted. If I'm a radar operator, I'm looking at a blip on the screen. I don't necessarily know if that's a unitary warhead, one big bomb, or a cluster warhead until it's already too late.
Well, not exactly. I should say you've hit on the core technical hurdle. The ideal time to hit a ballistic missile is in the mid-course phase when it's high up and moving predictably. But if you can't tell what's inside the bus, so to speak, you're gambling. If you wait until the terminal phase to see if submunitions deploy, you're often waiting until the missile is at 20,000 or 25,000 feet. At that point, the submunitions have already spread out. Your Patriot or your David Sling system can hit one or two, but the rest are going to rain down. You've intercepted the delivery vehicle, but the payload still hits the runway, the radar array, or the barracks.
It's like trying to stop a water balloon after it's already popped. You might catch a few drops, but you're still getting wet. And if that water is a bunch of armor-piercing bomblets hitting a line of F-35s, or that E-3 AWACS on the tarmac, the mission is over. I want to go back to that number Daniel mentioned, 48 Patriot battalions. That was the requirement found in modeling for a high-end threat. We have 16. Even with the planned jump to 19 by the end of this year, we aren't even at half of what the math says we need. Where does that leave the quarterback assets?
It leaves them incredibly vulnerable. Think about the logistics. A single Patriot battalion costs about $1.2 billion a year just to operate. We can't just build more overnight. The production lines for the missiles themselves are backlogged. So when General Schenck talks about the value of a soldier's life, he's talking about the brutal triage of air defense. If you only have enough interceptors to protect the command and control center or the troop housing, which one do you pick? If you choose the C2 center to keep the war going, you're essentially deciding that the lives in those barracks are a secondary priority. That is a haunting weight for any commander.
And it's a weight that's getting heavier because the adversary knows our math. They aren't trying to out-tech us in a vacuum. They're trying to out-calculate our magazine depth. If they can force us to use up our interceptors on dirt hits, bomblets that we're going to miss anyway, they win by attrition. Herman, walk me through the operator's perspective here. Daniel mentioned the cognitive load. You're the guy behind the glass. You see the release. Now what?
It's a nightmare. You have seconds. Once those submunitions are out, the radar returns get messy. You have to distinguish between the lethal submunitions and the debris or the ones that are falling harmlessly into the desert. But the sensors have limits. If the cluster munition is designed well, it creates a cloud of targets. If you pass engagement authority to the shooters, they might ripple fire millions of dollars worth of interceptors into a cloud of small targets that have already achieved their purpose just by existing. This is the wearing down of stocks Daniel mentioned. We are burning our most sophisticated interceptors, which we need for the next wave, on the first wave's leftovers.
It feels like we're playing a game of chess where the other guy gets to turn his pawns into a swarm of bees halfway across the board, and we're still trying to use our queen to swat them one by one. You mentioned the E-3 AWACS strike at Prince Sultan Air Base. That's a huge deal. That aircraft cost $10,000 an hour just to keep in the air. But on the ground, it's just a giant fragile target. Does this shift the focus away from active defense, the shooting down of things, and more toward what Schenck called the other pillars?
It has to. If the active part of the math is laughable, as Schenck put it, then you have to lean on the other three: passive defense, command and control, and the big one, attack operations, or left of launch. Passive defense is things like hardening hangars, which we've been weirdly slow to do at some of these overseas bases, or dispersal, moving planes around so one missile can't take out the whole fleet. But left of launch is where the real leverage is. If you can't catch the arrow, you have to kill the archer before he lets go.
Left of launch? It sounds proactive, but it's also incredibly escalatory, isn't it? If we see a mobile launcher fueling up in the Iranian desert, and we hit it with a cyber attack or a special ops team, or even a long-range precision missile of our own, we've just started a kinetic fight. But the alternative is waiting to receive a cluster salvo that we know, mathematically, we cannot fully stop.
That's the strategic trap. If our defensive shield is full of holes because we lack the force structure, the sheer number of units, then our only shield is actually a sword. We are forced into a pre-emptive posture because our reactive posture is a guaranteed failure. Daniel noted that Schenck includes offensive cyber in this. Imagine disrupting the command link that tells the missile to release its submunitions. If you can keep that warhead unitary by messing with its software, suddenly your Patriot system has a much easier job. One interceptor, one kill.
That's fascinating. So the battle is happening in the supply chain, and the code long before the radar even picks up a launch. But let's look at the special ops piece. Daniel mentioned eyes on target forward. That means putting teams deep in hostile territory to spot these mobile launchers. These launchers are notoriously hard to find. The Great Scud Hunt in the First Gulf War proved that. Dealing with cluster munitions means you don't just have to find the launcher, you have to find it now.
And that brings us back to the Pacific. Everything we're talking about with Iran is a small version of what a conflict with China would look like. People talk about the missile gap in the South China Sea. If we think 16 Patriot battalions are inadequate for the Middle East, they are practically a rounding error in a Pacific theater fight. The distances are vast. The volume of fire from the People's Liberation Army rocket force would be orders of magnitude higher, and their use of submunitions and decoys is even more advanced.
It's the same math, just with more zeros at the end. If the simulation says we need 48 battalions for a 2030 scenario, and we're sitting at 16, we are basically gambling that a major conflict won't happen, or that our left-of-launch capabilities are so good they can make up for a 66% deficit in defensive capacity. That seems like a massive gamble to take with high-demand assets.
It's a gamble that assumes perfect intelligence. To do left of launch effectively, you need to know exactly where the launchers are, when they're moving, and have the political will to strike first. If you wait for them to fire, you've already lost the resource battle. The cost exchange ratio is just too skewed. Think about it. A drone or a cheap ballistic missile costs maybe $50,000 to $100,000. The interceptor costs $4 million. You do that 10 times, and you've spent $40 million to stop $1 million of hardware. And that's assuming a 100% hit rate, which we know isn't the reality in a saturation attack.
Right, and we haven't even talked about the dirt hits again. If I'm the attacker, I'm going to mix in duds. I'm going to mix in missiles that are aimed at nothing just to see if you'll bite. And if you're a commander who is being told, protect this AWACS at all costs, you're going to bite. You're going to fire. You're going to burn through your magazine. Then, when the real city killer or carrier killer comes in, your launchers are empty or your operators are cognitively fried.
That's the interception rate trap we've talked about in other contexts. An 87% interception rate sounds great in a press release. But if the 13% that got through destroyed your only radar in the region or your only airborne command post, then that 87% was a total failure. The cluster munition is the perfect tool for ensuring that even with a high interception rate, the lethality of the leakage is maximized.
So what is the fix? Daniel mentions the 4 pillars. We've talked about active defense being limited and attack operations being escalatory. What about passive defense in C2? If we can't shoot them all down, and we can't hit them all on the ground, can we just get better at taking the punch?
Passive defense is the most unsexy, underfunded part of the military. It's concrete, it's dirt, it's camouflage, it's decoys. If you have 10 fake AWACS aircraft made of inflatable rubber and 1 real one, and the enemy uses a cluster munition to pepper the whole airfield, you've at least forced them to spread their submunitions thin. But we've spent 20 years fighting insurgencies where we didn't have to worry about ballistic missiles hitting our bases. We got lazy. We built big, beautiful, exposed bases like Prince Sultan or Al Udeid. Hardening those now is expensive and slow.
And the C2 piece, the command and control, that's the network. If the E3 gets taken out, like it did in March, how do we recover? Daniel's prompt mentions that these assets are irreplaceable in the short term. You don't just go to the AWACS store and buy a new one. The crews take years to train. The airframes are decades old. When one of those goes down, a literal darkness falls over the battlefield.
That's why the integrated part of integrated air and missile defense is so key. We need to move away from a single quarterback in a big, slow plane and toward a distributed sensor net. Drones, satellites, ground-based radars, all sharing data so that if one node, even a big one, goes down, the picture stays clear. But that requires a level of software integration we're still struggling to achieve. We're still very platform-centric. We think in terms of the Patriot or the Aegis ship rather than the sensor mesh.
It's the classic military struggle of moving from the industrial age to the information age. But the cluster munition is a very industrial solution to an information problem. It's just mass. It's just throwing enough stuff at the wall until the sophisticated computer on the other side crashes. I'm struck by Shank's comment that the results of the modeling were laughable. It's a rare bit of honesty from that level of leadership. He's essentially saying, we did the math. The math says we lose, and we're just kind of moving forward anyway.
It's a force structure deficit that has been building for 30 years. After the Cold War, we cut back on short-range and medium-range air defense because we assumed we'd always have air superiority. We assumed no one could touch our bases. Iran, and certainly China, have looked at that assumption and built a whole doctrine around shattering it. They don't need to win a dogfight if they can just destroy the tankers and the AWACS on the ground with a shotgun blast from 500 miles away.
So let's get into the practical takeaways here. If you're a policymaker or a warfighter listening to this, what do you do with this laughable math? One thing that jumps out to me is the left of launch necessity. If the defensive math doesn't work, you have to prioritize the offensive cyber and the special ops side of the house. You can't treat them as support anymore. They are the primary defensive shield.
I would go even further. We have to change how we value these assets. If a Patriot radar is the brain of the battery, we need to be producing them in numbers that allow for attrition. Right now, we treat a radar like a precious heirloom. If we lose one, the whole battalion is sidelined. We need attritable high-end tech. That sounds like an oxymoron, but it's the only way to survive a submunition environment. We need more, cheaper radars that can network together, so losing one is a nuisance, not a catastrophe.
And for the person on the ground, the operator perspective Daniel mentioned, it's about AI-assisted discrimination. A human brain cannot look at 50 submunitions and decide which ones are hitting dirt and which are hitting metal in 4 seconds. We need algorithms that can process that sensor data and say, ignore targets 1 through 40, focus all fire on 41 and 42. But then you get into the trust issue. Are we ready to let an AI decide which incoming missiles we don't try to stop?
That's the value of a life. Question again. If the AI says, let this one hit the barracks because we need to save the interceptor for the radar, and the AI is right strategically, but 20 soldiers die, who signs off on that? That's the ethical no man's land we're entering. But as General Schenck points out, we're already making those choices by default because we don't have enough battalions. We're just making them poorly and under stress instead of through a calculated system.
It's a grim reality, but avoiding it is what leads to the PSAP strike scenario. If you don't decide what's worth saving, the enemy will decide for you. Another takeaway is the importance of passive defense. It's not flashy, it doesn't get big contracts for defense giants the way a new missile does, but pouring concrete and building berms might save more lives than a $4 million interceptor ever could.
Dispersal and deception. If the cluster munition is a shotgun blast, don't stand in a tight circle. Spread out. Use decoys. Make the enemy waste their submunitions on plywood and heaters that look like jet engines. We need to get back to the deception. Part of warfare that we've largely ignored in the age of satellite supremacy. Even the best satellite can be fooled by a good decoy on the ground.
This really reframes the whole arms race for me. It's not about who has the fastest missile anymore. It's about who can manage the math of attrition better. Iran has found a very cost-effective way to put us in a corner. They aren't trying to match our technology. They're trying to bankrupt our magazine.
And the scary part is, it's working. Every time there's a flare-up and we see these massive salvos, the headline is, Israel and U.S. Intercept 99%. But the real story is the bill at the end of the night and the empty rows in the missile storage bunkers. We can't sustain that indefinitely. The math. Daniel brought us today is a warning that the current paradigm of air defense is hitting a hard ceiling.
It's a ceiling made of submunitions and million-dollar price tags. I think the biggest takeaway for me is that integrated air and missile defense isn't a technical term anymore. It's a survival strategy. You can't just buy your way out of this with more Patriots. You have to change the way you fight, from the left of launch cyber units to the guy pouring concrete for a new hangar. It's a whole-of-force problem.
And it's a problem that's only going to get more complex as AI and autonomous submunitions enter the fray. Imagine submunitions that don't just fall, but actually hunt for targets as they descend. That's the next step. If we're struggling with dumb cluster munitions today, we are in for a very rude awakening in the 2030s if we don't fix this laughable capacity gap.
Well, on that cheerful note, I think we've thoroughly unpacked the nightmare fuel Daniel sent over. It's a lot to think about, especially the idea that we're currently operating at about a third of the capacity that military modeling says we need for a major conflict. The gap between 16 and 48 isn't just a number, it's a lot of high-value assets and lives left unprotected.
It really is. And it's why these discussions are so critical. We can't wait for the big one to realize the math doesn't work. The destruction of that E3 in March was a loud, expensive wake-up call. The question is whether we're actually going to get out of bed and do the hard work of restructuring, or just hit the snooze button and hope for the best.
I suspect the snooze button is getting harder to find. Thanks for the deep dive, Herman Poppleberry. Your ability to make a mathematical nightmare sound both fascinating and terrifying is truly a gift.
Guilty as charged. It's a fascinating time to be watching this space, even if the stakes are incredibly high.
Before we hop off, I want to say thanks to our producer Hilbert Flumingtop for keeping the gears turning on this massive episode 2048. And a big thanks to Modal for providing the GPU credits that powered the generation of this show. This has been My Weird Prompts. If you want to keep up with the show and never miss an episode, search for My Weird Prompts on Telegram. It's the best way to get notified when we drop a new one.
We'll be back soon with another of Daniel's prompts. Until then, keep an eye on the math.
See ya. See ya. This episode was produced using Google Gemini 3 Flash, text-to-speech by Chatterbox.
Thanks for listening to our show, My Weird Prompts, where our thoughts go from slow takes to facts on cue. We change and follow through. My weird prompts.